because it is in the nature of man to worship, because that was how God created him. Man was created to be a worshiping being. So because of that, man can easily fall prey to false worship. And that's what Satan brought, and what Satan used to deceive Eve, the act of false worship. So the importance of knowing the biblical worship becomes very, very needful, so that we will be able to identify false worship when it comes our way. Because that's what Satan introduced to people. That's why you see many people today, even very, very committed Christians, committed Seventh-day Adventists, they still go to some other idol centers to worship those idols for one purpose or another, for one benefit or another. Why? Because man was created a worship being. Man desires to worship something. And I will tell you the reason. So, don't ever forget this. Don't ever forget this. In the Garden of Eden, God instituted the Garden of Eden and made man to be in control of two important aspects of its godly nature. And what are they? If you read Genesis chapter 1 verses 26 through 29, you'll find worship and service. So man was born to worship God and to serve God. Don't forget this, that you and I are born to worship God and to serve God. That's why those today who have been misled into idol worship, once they go into worshiping Satan or any fallen deity, they continue in serving that deity, because worship goes with service. And that is a problem we have today, that we are confusing ourselves between what it takes to serve God when you worship him and what it means to worship God when you serve him. We think that these two are on parallel rates. No, these two are so together that if you do not serve God, you cannot worship him. And if you do not worship God, you cannot serve him. Something thrown into fun part the other day. Some people think that serving God is being a pastor as I am, preaching as I'm preaching, being an elder in the church, or being a deacon or a deaconess, being a youth man. Hey, some people think that serving God is doing one kind of assignment in the church or another. No, those are assignments. Those are religious assignments. Those are spiritual assignments. Anyone can do them without worshiping God. You can do those assignments still worshiping Satan. So we're talking about service. We will understand what serving God means. All right, but before we go into that, there are 10 major worship experiences in the Bible. 10 major worship experiences in the Bible. And as I go through these 10 worship experiences, I will wish that you please follow the explanations very, very keenly and write down points that may form your question after this message. Because if you follow it well, you'll find out that in each of these major worship experiences, there was an important link, connectivity between the worshipped and the worshipper. In each of them, something really connected the worshipped and the worshipper. So that's where you put yourself in that realm to find out whether today, as you worship God as a Seventh-day Adventist, if something is really connecting you and God, if there is a connectivity between you, between me and God, if you can trace something linking you and the one you worship, or you just congregate alone for fellowship, Major worship experience number 1 is found in Genesis chapter 1 verses 1 and 2. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. You read down the story down, you find out at the Garden of Eden, God created man on the 6th day and rested on the 7th day. Now, when God was commissioning Adam, God told him, listen to me, Adam. Of all these other animals I have created and all the plants and everything, your assignment, your service is to give them names. Whatever name you call them, they will bear from eternity to eternity until this planet Earth is dissolved. All right? Then, in the Garden of Eden, God made it clear, listening to me very well, that his presence is available. So he created Adam and Eve in the realm of the sacredness of God's presence. And they were naked. And they did not observe the nakedness. They were unconscious of their physical being. They were spirit beings. Until when Satan came into the play and then led them through that very important instructional link. When God took Adam and Eve and God made them in his image, he positioned them in the Garden of Eden. And there was that interaction. And there was that relationship, worship relationship between God, Adam, and Eve. That worship, God told Adam, move around the garden every 6 days in the week. Give names to these other creatures. Take care of them. You be the steward. That is a service. I hand them over to you. I give you dominion. But on the 7th day, we come together for a worship. You will realize my supremacy as your creator. On the 7th day of the week, you bow down to me. You kneel down to me. You worship me. That was the agreement between Adam and God. But God told him, look at that fruit of the tree in the middle of the Garden of Eden. Any day you touch it, this relationship will end. So, in the worship covenant that God instituted in Adam and Eve in Garden of Eden, you find that the major connecting point between God and Adam was obedience. The day you touch of the fruit of that tree, you will surely die. You will die. And when you die, you have no knowledge of me again, because you will die in sin. Now pay attention to this. So that worship relationship was strongly covenanted in obedience. Man obeying his creator and keeping to that instruction. The creator expecting man to continue in that obedience. And that was what Satan fought and succeeded. That is worship experience number 1. After that, in Genesis chapter 4, another worship experience was tested when sin had come. But at this point, there was need for the sampling of obedience in the man, the offsprings of Adam, about the God their father worships, between Cain and Abel. And God called them to come and worship him. Listen to that. God's instruction was, take what you produce and worship me. God was trying to create a worship relationship between the sons of Adam and Eve though that there have been a fall, and then they have been sent out from the Garden of Eden. But don't forget, immediately after that, that was why this opportunity came to Adam, to Cain and Abel. God quickly came immediately and then slaughtered an innocent lamb, and then used it to cover Adam and Eve. That was the privilege of salvation. So that extension was given to Cain and Abel. What happened? When the two of them were exposed to that act of worship, Abel obeyed God. He listened to God's instruction, and Cain disobeyed God. And you know the story. So if you find that in that worship relationship, what was a very strong and powerful link there was obedience. To that of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden with God, it was obedience. To that of Cain and Abel, it was obedience. The one who obeyed was accepted. His own worship was accepted. Don't forget, at the beginning I mentioned to you that worship is about attitude and act. So when in the Garden of Eden, God told Adam and Eve, don't touch the fruit of that tree. That was an act. Don't touch it. The attitude was to be reflected in the process of obeying the word of the Creator, the Father. But Satan came and struck on that. That's why what Satan attacks today in our life is the attitude of godliness and the act of obedience. So in the first worship link, what was disconnected was obedience. In the second worship link, what was disconnected was obedience. Obedience will be cut off, and the moment it's cut off, that worship link is cut off, and man is on his own, and God is on his own. A man lives in lust, a man lives in formalism, a man lives in doing all that he wants or she wants to do. Even some, we do them in the name of God. Okay, the third major worship experience took place in Genesis chapter 7 verses 1 to 7. Between Noah and his generation. You know the story. But I want you to follow something down lane as we go through these 10 major worship experiences. And you will tell me what was the common denominator. So that you know where you are today. I know where I am today. I know when you are following Pentecostal worship, when you're following Orthodox worship, when you're following Catholic worship, when you're following whatever new generation worship, you check very well whether those practices agrees with the biblical worship. And that is my concern today. And to those who are listening, and to those who will listen, biblical worship is different from Catholic worship. Is different from Pentecostal worship. Is different from Orthodox worship. Let's check through the major worship experiences in the scripture. You'll find the similarity. And you will come back to the scripture, you compare for yourself. Okay? God called Noah. I found favor, oh my dear son, in your sight. You are a very good man. I tell you what will save your generation. Go build an ark. Call those who will follow you. Those, whoever will want to follow you and build the ark will be saved from the deluge that is coming. Two things are there. Attitude and act. What was the attitude? God saw an attitude of reverence, loyalty to God. And God picked him because of the attitude. And he gave him an act. The worship was consummated in that practical attitude and act. And Noah went out, called those he could call. For so many years he was preaching. He was talking to people. It was only his family members that could believe in him. The scripture tells us, family of 8 was only saved. What happened? There was a worship link of obedience. Whosoever will contribute, will be part of building the ark, is obeying not Noah, but God. And that is a root of salvation. The moment you keep to that instruction, you are following a humble approach of reverence to a higher being. You are following a humble approach of showing your loyalty to a higher being. You are obeying. You are showing that obedience to a higher being. So that link was cut off. There was no obedience. It was only Adam, it was only Noah and his family members that kept the instruction and they obeyed. And there was that cordiality, there was that reference of worship. Now the fourth major worship experience is recorded in Genesis chapter 11. If you read from verse 1 to 4, and what happened at the Tower of Babel? Tower of Babel. Everybody came together. You know the story of Nimrod and his mother Semiramis. I'm not going into that. But I'm looking at that worship that could struggle to build a tower to heaven. They all agreed. They came together. There was an act of obedience amongst each of them. Oh, bring cement. Oh, bring mortar. Oh, bring block. Oh, bring stick. Oh. Everybody was working together. There was that obedience. When God saw that obedience amongst them was raising a structure to heaven, God confused that obedience. They could not obey each other again by confusing their language. Look at that link. That link got the moment obedience amongst men, keeping to the agreement of each other, was cut into, there was disagreement and they could not move forward. Worship, when people come together to reverence a higher authority. Now the fifth one took place in 1 Kings chapter 18, verse 20 to 40, between Elijah and the prophets of Baal. You read that scriptures, you find the worship that transpired there. Which God is supreme? That was what was for. The supremacy of God, the creator God, or the supremacy of Baal, of Beelzebub. That was the battle between the two prophets. And there was that instruction. Call your God. I will call my God. Which of these gods that come to consume these sacrificial materials with fire shall be the God? When the follow worship, each of these two groups of worshippers use their different approaches. The Baalistic worshippers use their different approach, their noisy approach, their Pentecostal approach. You see, that's why we're looking at the biblical type of worship, which must be followed. All right? So the Baalistic people, in their own approach, the Pentecostal method of worship that we are seeing today, they used it, they made the noise, they shouted, they hit their heads on the wall, they even started cutting themselves, which is the worship approach of some other religions. The traditional religion used that one, cutting on themselves. They did everything. In that same Baalistic worship, you find that the Islamic method of worship, of raising their voice early in the morning and late evening, that is the Islamic method. If you see what the prophets of Baal did, they picked one by one all the worship method of all these other groups I have mentioned, the Catholics, the Orthodox, the Muslims, the Hinduists. They picked the traditionalists. If you check in what the prophets of Baal did, they picked on all these approaches one after another. But that was not Elijah's approach. The biblical approach of worship, when it was time for Elijah to call his God, he did two things. Number one, he looked up to heaven. Number two, he prepared the environment, the altar, very well. He equipped the altar very well to prove to those other people, to his opponents, that the God we worship is a God that answers prayer, a God that is omnipresent. Omnipresent. He doesn't need shouting. He doesn't need noise. He doesn't need cutting yourself. He doesn't need sacrifice. The moment Elijah finished putting every doubt out from the people that there is a God who answers prayers, he called him, Lord, it's time for you to come and consume this sacrifice, a gift. Because Elijah kept to the instruction that God has given to him. He followed the instruction, the principles of worship, of biblical worship. Quickly, God appeared in a fire and consumed all that was on the altar. Special worship experience. You see how the Baalists did this? You see how Prophet Elijah did this? Now, in Exodus chapter 3, verses 2 to 6, there was this worship that consummated between Moses and God in the burning bush. Also follow this worship experience very well. Moses was watching, and as he's watching, he was seeing a burning bush. He was so disturbed, he was touched. Curiously, he wanted to find out what was happening. As he was approaching that tree, God called him by his name and said, "Oh, Moses, stop there. For where you're standing is a holy ground. Off your sandals." And quickly he did that. Now look at that. God instructed Moses. God gave Moses a command. Where you are is a holy place. Remove your sandals and listen to me. There was that obedience and the worship relationship between God and Moses and the burning bush. Obedience was traced. It was not caught. There was that of obedience between God and Elijah. It was not caught. At the Tower of Babel, obedience was there, but it was caught. And you see how this confusion came amongst them. So Moses quickly removed the shoes and he partook in that act of worship. He showed obeisance to God. He bowed down to him. And as he was bowing down his head long, God spoke to him and gave him the assignment. Worship. Now in Exodus chapter 32 verses 1 to 4, there was a worship at Mount Sinai. You can read that. That was another worship that relates to that of the people of Babel. The children of Israel decided to turn their backs to God and not to face the God of the molded golden calf. What happened? They now shifted their loyalty. They shifted their obedience. Oh, we don't know if Moses will come back again. Moses has stayed too long where he went. Can you please construct a golden calf for us to worship?